The evidence to me that just cries out that there's a God is the study of DNA. DNA is a very powerful, massive information storage system. In fact, DNA that makes up our genes actually is like books of information that's read by a language system. It's absolutely phenomenal. And scientists know today that languages, a code, only come from an intelligence, and information only comes from information. Nobody's ever seen matter by itself give rise to a code. Nobody's ever seen matter by itself give rise to information. And as you look at DNA, it actually cries out, meaning God created the universe.
We all begin as a single cell the size of a period at the end of a sentence. How does that cell know how to build a body with 100 trillion cells in it, thousands of different kinds, and each one of them is so complex, nanochemical machinery beyond our comprehension how it works, and encoded is the instruction manual. It's the manufacturer's manual how to build and operate every part of this incredible body made up of 100 trillion cells.
Furthermore, DNA is a three-dimensional molecule that is self-replicating. Each molecule is able to make an identical copy quickly and efficiently. The Lord has even programmed DNA to detect and correct replication errors. These sophisticated capabilities far exceed man's means.
God has created the DNA molecule in such a way that it is self-correcting. There are special proteins called enzymes that go up and down the DNA molecule looking for and making repairs on a minute-by-minute, second-by-second basis. God created us with a DNA code that actually has what we call editase or editorial type enzymes. Just as an editor reads a newspaper or a book looking for mistakes, so God has created special enzymes that go up and down our DNA molecule, repairing the mistakes in ways that are unbelievably complex.
Our DNA has information in it. And there is a whole field of scientific study called information science, which studies how information originates, how it's transmitted, and so on. And one of the laws of information science says that information never originates by itself in matter, never spontaneously comes about. Anytime we trace the copying of information back to its source, it always comes back to a mind. And since we have creative information in DNA, that tells me that DNA comes from intelligence. It's not something that could possibly come about through millions of years of mutations and natural selection.
Okay, so 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, that's the beginning of the Fibonacci sequence. Next number in the sequence, what do you think? How about 8? The number after that, 13. The number after that, 21. So if you're getting those right along with me, then you've recognized the pattern that I wrote with the first few numbers in the Fibonacci sequence, which is this. It starts with a 1, the next number is a 1, then after that, to get the next number, you'll always add the two numbers that came before that. So 1 and 1 is 2, 1 and 2 is 3, 2 and 3 is 5, 3 and 5 is 8, so on and so forth. So that's recognizing the pattern that exists in the Fibonacci sequence. So it turns out that this sequence of numbers has all kinds of applications. It describes all kinds of things in the world that we see around us.
There's a conspiracy to hide this information that DNA is a Fibonacci, is an exemplification of this number called, or entity ratio sequence called the golden ratio, the ratio that proves the existence of intelligent design, or the reality of intelligent design of the cosmos. I mean, if you go to the golden ratio site for Wikipedia too on the same theme, they don't mention any of this stuff in nature that we're going to talk about here, that we talked about on the show 2 days ago, and that we're talking about here. They talk about how it's found in architecture and math and all this kind of stuff. They don't discuss it how it's found in the measurements of the human arm. Why not? It's just, I mean, well, I think I'm making, that's the point here. I think that just made sense to me, thinking this through as I say it to you. It has to be a conspiracy. How could all of this be overlooked, and how could Wikipedia leave it out? It can't be. There has to be somehow that big money has pushed their influence somehow, and they've had a drive to keep this covered up or something. These can't all be coincidences, and since they're doing that with everything else, it has to be the case that there's some movement to keep this stifled. I mean, why isn't, and here's another piece to add to this, why isn't this in our education system? We learn all this junk geometry, pea-brain stuff when you take geometry in high school, and they don't teach you about any of this, the golden ratio everywhere in nature. I went through elementary school, high school, college, undergrad degree in college, master's degree, and halfway through PhD, and never was any of this mentioned. And we know who controls the universities, the big money behind it, all the way up to the Illuminati Nephilim controllers. So this can't be, this is planned, okay? And you just wonder, it's got to, I mean, I'm almost concluding here in my mind this Davidson College site showing up #1 in Google all the time and first page, and Wikipedia having these strange measurements which don't correlate with all kinds of these examples from academic sites I'm finding. I'm putting them all, pictures of the screenshots in the newsletter. It's got to be a conspiracy. I mean, we could keep going compiling the evidence, it would just all lead to it. So, and if we could keep compiling evidence of it being a conspiracy, I mean, everything points towards it. I'm just throwing ideas off the top of my head. These strange sites show up at the top. Wikipedia's wrong. It's covered up completely in the best-selling books about the golden ratio, which come from wealthy university professors. It's the universities and the education, government-controlled education system absolutely covers it up. You see how, I mean, everything's falling in the same direction. So when everything, all these conclusions point to the same direction, that it's covered up and hidden. Case.
But the evidence is overwhelming that there is an intentionality and a design that underlies our existence. So as a scientist, my thinking was, if that's true, who or whatever put us here on Earth would have left something inside of every one of us that tells us we're part of a greater existence and tells us that we're a family and that we're not so different from one another. And if I could find that, if I could find that common denominator, that somehow maybe it would help us to become greater than the differences, that began a search. And I combined the science that I know of biology and history and ancient language, linguistics, genetics, with the new science of computers that were now on my desktop. And Daryl, I'll tell you, I remember the very first time as a scientist that I had the opportunity to see the human genome, a piece of human DNA coded on my computer screen. And all the CTAG, it all rolled down through the screen. And my brain looked at that. And I remember thinking, I said, I don't know what that says, but there's a code. There's a language. That DNA is a language. And whatever that language is, it's inside of me, and it's inside of everyone that looks at it. And some intelligent being placed it there a long time ago.
Using all the technology at his disposal, Mr. Braden then began searching for the message encoded in our DNA.
And this led to a research project using computers, the best science of today, and some of those ancient texts. And the bottom line is that what we discovered is every single ancient language, the letters of the language link to very precise numbers that have never changed. So whether we're talking about the Arabic language or the Hebrew language, or if we're talking about cuneiform and Sanskrit, what are called the ancient core or the ancient root languages, there's a mysterious number that's always been linked to those letters, and nobody knows where the numbers came from. That was interesting to me. So through a process that took many years, I came to understand that the numbers that represent the letter are also the numbers that represent the elements, what we call the elements on the periodic table of life and a physical reality as we know it. So in other words, it is if the ancients, they didn't know about the periodic table of elements the way we do today, but they knew about the numbers that were represented. And when we make the connections between the letters of the ancient alphabets, the numbers they represent, those numbers, if we look at them on the periodic table, they happen to be precisely the elements that make the DNA in our bodies. Now, we have the ability to take the sequences of DNA in a cell and through those numbers link them to letters in ancient alphabets. And lo and behold, the letters spell words and the words have meaning. And this has led to a book that's entitled The God Code. It was released in the year 2004. What we know is that there is a message, an intentional message within the DNA of all life. The message occurs in layers, and each layer has its own code that must be understood for that layer. And I'm still working on the deeper layers.
Greg Braden says the message hidden in the DNA of all living beings is that which spiritual masters have tried to convey to humanity through the ages. He now reveals what's written in the topmost layer of our genetic code.
The top layer is one that we understand very well right now. The top layer in the DNA of all life literally translates into the words God eternal within the body. God eternal within the body. We don't know who put that message there. We don't know exactly why it's there. But I can tell you that all I did was I followed the instructions in a series of ancient texts, following those languages, and I married that with the science of today, and this is what we found. If a higher intelligence is responsible for our existence, and that intelligence created us, it makes perfect sense that that intelligence would have left something for us to understand who we are. And if they left it in a temple or a text that could be destroyed and disappear over time, it wouldn't make sense. It makes perfect sense that that higher intelligence would have left the message encoded into the creation itself. And as long as the creation exists, the message is intact.
And it was very interesting. The human genome is the blueprint inside every cell that explains how to build all the proteins in your body. And I love the words of President Clinton when they announced this breakthrough. They'd actually mapped the human genome. He said, today, we are learning the language in which God created life. And that's exactly true. DNA is quite literally language. It's language. Inside every one of your 100 trillion cells in your body is this famous double helix of DNA. And if you were to open it up and stretch it out, it would stretch out 6 feet long inside every one of your cells. And it is encoded with a 4-character chemical alphabet that precisely spells out the assembly instructions for all of the thousands of different kinds of proteins out of which your body is constructed. In fact, DNA is the most efficient information storage system in the universe. Our science cannot come anywhere near replicating the ability of DNA to contain information. I'll give you an example. This will blow your mind. Picture a teaspoon of peanut butter. You know what that looks like? A teaspoon of peanut. Now imagine that's not peanut butter. Imagine that is pure DNA. How much genetic information could that teaspoon of DNA hold? Just 1 teaspoon of DNA could hold all of the precise assembly instructions for all of the proteins of every one of the 1,000 million species of animals that have ever existed on the planet, and still have information left over for all of the information in every book ever written. That is how efficient DNA is in storing information. It's absolutely mind-boggling. Now, how does DNA point toward God? Well, think about this. How many people saw the motion picture Contact? Anybody ever see that movie? Wow, more than I thought. It didn't do that well. That's kind of surprised. Well, the movie Contact is based on a book by Carl Sagan. And in this movie and in the book, scientists are trying to find out, is there intelligent life anywhere on the planet? And so they have these radio telescopes that are scanning the sky for any kind of sign of life. But all they receive is static. just random sounds. And they make the very reasonable conclusion that there's no intelligence behind these random sounds. That's just a sound that is out there in the universe. But then one day, they begin receiving a transmission of prime numbers. Prime numbers are numbers that are divisible only by themselves or by the number 1. So they start getting these numbers coming at them. And the scientists reason, and again, this is quite rational, they reason it is far too improbable that there be natural causes behind a string of numbers like that. This wasn't disorganized static. This was information. This was a message with content. And from that, they concluded there must be an intelligence behind these numbers. Carl Sagan himself said, look, the receipt of a single message from space would be enough to know that there's intelligence out there. But, friends, what is DNA? It is a message with content. It is a language. Just like English uses a 26-letter alphabet, DNA uses a 4-letter chemical alphabet. In fact, inside every cell of the human body is as many words as you would find in thousands of editions of your Sunday newspaper. It's the specific, detailed, written instructions for how to build all of the proteins in the human body. Where did that come from? If a single message from space is enough for us to conclude there must be an intelligence behind that, then what about this vast amount of information that's contained in the DNA of every animal on the planet? Nature by itself can't produce information. It can produce patterns. You know, if you're walking down the beach and you see ripples in the sand, what's your conclusion? Well, that nature, the waves, were coming up on shore and created this pattern. Nature can produce patterns, no problem. But if you're walking down the beach and you see John loves Mary and a heart with a arrow through it, you wouldn't conclude that the waves created that. Why? Because that's information with content. Nature doesn't do that. Nature produces patterns. It doesn't produce information with content. And whenever we see written information like that, whether it's in a book, whether it's in a newspaper, whether it's in a computer code, we know there is intelligence behind it. And when we look at DNA and we see these written instructions for the assembly of proteins in our bodies, I believe we are looking at some of the most powerful evidence that there must be an intelligence behind life. As King David wrote in Psalm 139, "For you, God, created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well." And there's plenty of evidence from 21st century science to know that full well. As one of the leading experts in the molecular world, Dr. James Tour of Rice University, he is on the cutting edge of nanotechnology. He files a new patent about once a week. I had lunch with him recently. It's unbelievable what they're building on the molecular. He builds molecules for a living. That's what he does. He creates molecular machines. He says, very hard work. That's what he does. This is what he said, quote, "I stand in awe of God because of what he has done through his creation." He said, "Only a rookie who knows nothing about science would say that science takes away from faith." He said, "If you really study science, it will bring you closer to God." This is from one of our greatest scientists of our generation.
DNA is the instruction manual for how to build life. From animals to plants to humans, it defines us all. Information is stored in DNA using 4 types of molecules, which come in pairs. We have billions of these pairs. DNA folds itself into paired packages called chromosomes, which are stored in the nucleus of cells. Each species has a different number of chromosomes. Humans have 46 chromosomes, which contain our genes. Genes act as instructions for molecules called proteins. In humans, genes vary in size from a few hundred DNA bases to more than 2 million bases, and we have an estimated 20,000 to 25,000 of these genes passed during reproduction. Each person has 2 copies of each gene, one inherited from each parent, and most genes are the same in all people except for a small number of genes being slightly different. These small differences contribute to each person's unique physical characteristics, varying from height, color, and personality traits. Some genes are dominant and some are recessive. Dominant genes are more often expressed as observable characteristics, while recessive genes are often masked by dominant genes. The recessive genes are expressed when inherited from both parents. While we share 98% of our DNA with bonobos and chimpanzees, we don't quite look alike because that 2% equals thousands and thousands of different genes. And while all humans share over 99% of our DNA with each other, what we don't share is what makes us unique in our own way.
In the field of genetics, today we have come to know that it is the sperm which is responsible for determining the sex of the child. And today science tells us that the 23rd pair of chromosomes in the human being, it determines the sex of the child. If it's XX, it's a female. If it's XY, then it's a male. So it is the sperm which is responsible for determining the sex. If the X of the sperm takes part in the fertilization, then a female is born. If the Y takes part, then a male is born. And this is exactly what the Quran says in Surah Najm, chapter number 53, verse number 45 and 46, that we have created the human being from a minute quantity of liquid which is ejaculated. Minute quantity of liquid, ejaculated means it has to be a male fluid. The similar message is repeated in Surah Qiyamah, chapter number 75, verse number 37 to 39, that we have created the human being from a minute quantity of sperm. Lutful min man yumna. We have created the human being from minute quantity of sperm, then made it into an alaqa, then made the alaqa into mudga, then gave it sex, male and female. So the Quran says that the sperm is responsible for the sex of the child, whether it's male or female. The Quran says in Surah Az-Zumur, chapter 39, verse number 6, that we have made the human beings in stages, one after the other, in 3 veils of darkness. According to Professor Keith Moore, he said that this verse of the Quran, when it mentions the 3 veils of darkness, it refers to the anterior abdominal wall, the uterine wall, and the amniochorionic membrane. That the human being is made into stages in 3 veils of darkness. The Quran describes the various embryological stages in great detail. The Quran mentions in Surah Mu'minun, chapter number 23, verse number 12 to 14, that we have created the human being from a quintessence of clay, then made it into a nutfa, a minute quantity of liquid, then made the nutfa into alaqa, a leech-like substance, then made the alaqa into mudga, that's a chewed-like lump, then made the mudga into izama, bones, then clothed the bones with lahem, that is flesh. And then we made a different creature. Glory be to Allah, who's the best to create. These 3 verses of the Quran describe the various embryological stages, the initial stages of development of a human being in the mother's womb in great detail. First it says that it made it from a nutfa, which we discussed, a minute quantity of liquid, then made the nutfa into alaqa. That means a leech-like substance, which we discussed earlier. The meaning of the Arabic word alaqa, it has got 3 meanings. One is a leech-like substance. It also means something which clings. And the third meaning of alaqa is congealed clot of blood. Besides it looking like a leech, the embryo in the initial stages, it also behaves like a leech, it behaves like a bloodsucker, it derives its nutrition from the mother through the placenta. It behaves like a bloodsucker. So besides looking like a leech, it also behaves like a leech. The second meaning, something which clings, we know that the embryo clings to the uterine wall. Throughout the 9 months that the fetus is in the womb of the mother, it clings to the uterine wall. The third meaning of alaqa is congealed clot of blood. And today's science tells us that in the initial stages, the blood does not circulate. And the blood clots in the vessels, and appears like a congealed clot of blood. So all 3 meanings of alaqa, alhamdulillah, today's science says is in perfect conformity to latest advances made in embryology. It further says, we placed it in a qararim makin, a place of security. And we know today that the fetus is protected posteriorly by the spinal column, the backbone, as well as the posterior muscles. And anteriorly it is protected by the anterior abdominal wall, by the amniochorionic membrane, as well as the amniotic fluid, which protects the child. So the science today testifies that the child is well protected in the womb of the mother. It further says, we made the alaka into a mudga. A mudga means a chewed-like lump. So Professor Keith Moore took a plasticine and made it look into a leech-like substance, initial stage of embryo, and then placed it between his teeth. He bit it to make it appear like a mudga, a chewed-like lump. And when he saw it, the teeth marks, it resembled the somites from where the nerves develop. And the Quran continues, we made the mudga into izama, bones, then clothed the bones with lahem, that is flesh. Then we made it altogether a different creature. So what does the Quran mean that we made it into altogether different creature? Till this stage of mudga, izama, lahem, chewed-like lump, bones, flesh, till this stage, today science tells us the initial stages of development of a human being is similar to the development of a fish, rabbit, and many other animals. Only after this stage does the human development differ in looks, where we have a head, then we have limbs. Then the Quran says, we made it into a different creature. Glory be to Allah, who is the best to create. Imagine, the Quran describes the various embryological stages in great detail. And Professor Keith Moore, he said that this description given in the Quran, based on shapes, alaka, leech-like substance, mudga, chewed-like lump, izama, bones, laham, flesh, is far superior to the divisions made in modern embryology, where we say stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. It's difficult to identify. The description given in the Quran is far more superior and much more easy. And previously the scientists, they thought it was in the 16th and 17th century when scientists like Swammerdam, they thought that the sperm contained the miniature human being. The head of the sperm contained the miniature human being, and then it grew in the womb of the mother. Later on, when they came to know that the size of the ovum is bigger than the sperm, de Grasse, he said that the human being is present in the ovum and not the sperm. Later on in 18th century, Maupertus, he propounded the biparental theory that both the ovum and the sperm is responsible for the creation of the human being. They fertilize, they form the zygote, which the Quran has described in great detail. Furthermore, the Quran says in Surah Hajj, chapter number 22, verse number 5, that we have created the human beings from a minute quantity of clay, made into alaka, made the alaka into mudga, partly formed and partly unformed. This verse of the Quran was taken to Dr. Marshall Johnson, who is the head of the Department of Anatomy in Daniel Institute in Sir Thomas Jefferson University in USA, in Philadelphia. Now we have come to know in science that if at this stage we cut the embryo and we analyze the organs, we find some of the organs are formed, some are not formed. So Professor Marshall Johnson said, if we describe this stage of the embryo as a complete creation, it will be wrong, because some organs are not formed. If we label it as an incomplete creation, that's also wrong, because some of the organs are formed. So there's no better description than the description mentioned in the Quran, partly formed and partly unformed. In Arabic, it can also be treated as differentiated and undifferentiated. And Professor Marshall Johnson said that at this stage, some cells are differentiated, some are undifferentiated. Further is mentioned in the Quran, in Surah Sajda, chapter number 32, verse number 9, that we have given the human beings the faculty of hearing and sight. It's mentioned in Surah Insan, chapter number 76, verse number 2. We have given to the human being the gift of hearing, sight, and feeling. But the Quran first speaks about hearing, then it speaks about sight. And today's science tells us the first sense to develop in a human being is the sense of hearing. By the 22nd day, the ear starts to formulate, and by the 5th month of pregnancy, it is completed. And later on, the eye splits open, that's in the 7th month of pregnancy. So the Quran is perfect in conformity with science. First comes the sense of hearing, then comes the sense of sight.
Faith in the Quran, that Quran cannot be wrong, because scientifically, if you heard my lecture, 80% of the Quran is 100% matching with science. 20% is ambiguous, neither right, neither wrong. So my logic says when 80% is 100% correct and not even 0.1% of the 20% is wrong, so my logic says even this 20% would be right. I'm a scientific person, I'm a logical person. So I believe in the statement of the Quran.
But how I wish you'd be here with me all year around. Ramadan.
Are you going so fast tonight? Have you ever stopped beside the road to smell the rose of life? Take a breath now, don't hold it in too long, 'cause you might end up missing out on life's short little song. She's saying, ooh, you've got one